That night, I came home with a bag of takeout still warm in my hand. I had no idea it would be the last night I was ever her husband.
Zion, your place in this house is over.
I'll take care of her for you, man.
You should be grateful. We're letting you leave with your dignity.
Dignity? You just slammed the door while I was still standing in the rain.
Zion, it's all over now. Get out of my sight.
Because the bag I carried that night wasn't just soaked through with rain. It carried a secret. One that, in exactly 3 weeks, would burn everything they just built, straight down to the ground.
My name is Zion Hale. I'm 37 years old, and for most of my life, I believed one simple thing. If you work hard and stay quiet about it, the people you love will see your worth eventually. You don't have to announce it. You just have to keep building and let time do the talking. That belief cost me almost everything. And it saved me too. 14 months before the night my life split into a before and after, my wife left her phone on the kitchen counter and stepped into the shower. I wasn't looking for anything. I never had a reason to. But the screen lit up with a message from a name I didn't recognize yet, Azriel. And it said, "Is the exit strategy ready? How do we keep him from suspecting?" I read it twice. Then I set the phone back down exactly where I found it, face up, same angle, same spot. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't confront her the next night either. I just quietly took a photograph of the screen, and I kept it in a folder nobody knew existed. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to remember something. Sometimes the biggest mistake other people ever make is underestimating you while you're standing there, silent, taking it all in. Now let me take you back to where this really started, on an ordinary Tuesday night on Peachtree Street, with a bag of takeout getting cold in my hand. I lived in Buckhead, on the north side of Atlanta, in a brick 2-story my wife's mother liked to call modest but respectable. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm downtown, the kind of job people forget to ask follow-up questions about. Nobody at that dinner table ever asked what I did after hours. If they had, they might have learned something. But nobody asked. So I never had to explain that I wasn't just managing other people's projects. I was quietly building something of my own. That particular Tuesday had been a long one. A permit delay on a job site off Northside Drive, a supplier who didn't return 3 calls, and a wait at the Good Ethiopian place on Cheshire Bridge Road because I wanted Ayanna to have something better than the frozen dinners she'd been complaining about all week. The rain had just started, that soft Atlanta drizzle that smells like warm asphalt, and I remember thinking, she's going to be surprised. Ayanna Hale was 34 then, sharp and beautiful in the way that turns heads at a restaurant. Marketing manager at a firm downtown, always dressed like she was one promotion away from the cover of a magazine. I loved her. I want to say that plainly because everything I'm about to tell you doesn't erase the 5 years I spent loving her. I paid the mortgage every month on that house in Buckhead. I quietly covered her mother's cancer treatment 2 years earlier through an anonymous fund at the hospital, so no one in the family would ever feel the weight of it or feel indebted to me. I turned down a daytime promotion once just so I could be home for dinner more often. None of that made the papers of our marriage. None of that seemed to matter. I climbed the porch steps that night with the bag warm against my chest, keys already in hand. And that's when the door opened before I even reached it. Ayanna stood in the doorway, dressed to go out, not to greet me, to leave. Her face was flat, unreadable, already decided. Behind her stood her mother, Kiara Lang, 58 years old, arms crossed over her chest, wearing the expression of a woman who had been waiting years for this exact moment and was finally getting to enjoy it. And beside them both stood a man in a slate gray suit, his hand resting on my wife's shoulder like he'd been standing in that spot his whole life. His name, I would learn soon enough, was Azriel Reed. Ayana looked me dead in the eye and said, "Zion, your place in this house is over." Kiara didn't say a word. She just smiled, the kind of smile you give when you've been rehearsing a moment in your head for a long time, and it finally arrives exactly on cue. Azrael didn't smile with his mouth, he smiled with his eyes, the quiet satisfaction of a man who thinks he's already won. Ayana's chin was lifted like a woman certain of herself, but her hands stayed pressed flat against her sides, the way you brace before a fall you've already decided is worth it. She needed me gone before I could ask a single question that might unravel a year of careful lying. And the fastest way to silence a guilty conscience is to convince yourself the person you're wronging never deserved better in the first place. I understood, standing there in the rain, that her coldness wasn't strength. It was the last defense of someone who already suspected, somewhere underneath all that composure, that she was about to lose far more than she'd bargained for. I stood there on the porch, rain starting to fall harder now, the takeout bag still warm in my hand, and nobody said another word. Nobody explained. Nobody asked me in out of the rain. There was just silence, and 3 sets of eyes looking at me like I was something they were finished with. My wife had rehearsed that line. I could hear it in the way she said it, too clean, too composed, like she'd practiced it in the bathroom mirror the way some people practice a wedding toast. The rain came down harder. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just stood there and let it soak through my shirt while the woman I married closed the door in my face. The deadbolt clicked into place with a sound so small and so final, it seemed to echo louder than anything else that night. That's the sound of a 5-year marriage ending. Not with shouting, not with tears, just a lock turning, and a porch light going dark behind curtained glass. I stood in the rain, the bag growing heavier with water, and I whispered something to myself that I meant with my whole chest. You just made the biggest mistake of your lives, and you don't even know it yet. Because here's what nobody standing behind that door understood. I wasn't walking away with nothing. I was walking away with a copy of everything. Bank records, screenshots, legal documents drawn up months earlier by a lawyer they didn't know existed, and a truth about who I really was that would take exactly 3 weeks to detonate. They thought they'd just thrown out a tired construction manager with nowhere to go. They had no idea what was actually standing on that porch. Nobody came out to help me. I gathered what I could from the porch, a duffel bag I kept in the hall closet for work trips, a box of tools from the garage, my grandfather's old pocket watch that I'd left on the dresser, and I did it all in the rain, alone, while 3 people stood warm and dry behind curtained glass. Kiara cracked the door once, just enough to say, "You should be grateful. We're letting you leave with your dignity." I looked at her, water running down the back of my collar, and I said, "Dignity? You just closed the door on me while I was still standing in the rain." She didn't have an answer for that. She just shut the door again, softer this time, like the first slam had already made her point and a second one would be excessive. Our neighbor Ms. Odessa lived across the street in the house with the wraparound porch and the wind chimes that never stopped moving even on the stillest days. She was 71, widowed 11 years, and she'd waved at me most mornings for as long as we'd lived on that street. That night, her porch light flicked on for just a second, curtain pulled back an inch, then let go. She'd seen enough of the world to know when a man needed to be left alone with his own silence, and she had the grace not to come out into the rain and ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. I made a note, somewhere quiet in my chest, to thank her properly one day. She was the only soul on that street who ever looked at me like I mattered, without needing something in return. I want to tell you what those 5 years actually looked like, because it matters for what comes later. I paid the mortgage on that house every single month, on time, without fail. When Kiara was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer 3 years into our marriage, I set up an anonymous fund through the hospital's billing office so her treatments were covered in full, and so nobody in that family would ever have to feel the particular shame of owing me anything. I introduced Ayana to 3 clients through a contact of mine downtown, connections that helped push her marketing career forward faster than she ever admitted out loud. And still, somewhere along the way, I became the boring husband. The one with no ambition. The anonymous fund for Kiara's treatment wasn't complicated to set up, just careful. I worked with a hospital administrator I'd met years earlier on a renovation project, and every payment came through a name that wasn't mine, routed so quietly that Kiara thanked the Lord's mercy for a benefactor she assumed she'd never meet. She sat across from me at holiday dinners for 2 straight years, telling that story like a miracle, never once looking at the man who'd actually written the checks. I let her have that story. I never needed the credit. I only needed her to get well. That's the part that still stings a little now. Not that she didn't know, but that even not knowing, she still decided I wasn't worth keeping around. Looking back, I can see now that Kiara had been coaching Ayana in small doses for years, not just the 14 months she finally admitted to. A comment here about a coworker's husband and his corner office. A sigh there about how some women get to relax a little more in their marriages. It was never one big conversation. It was a slow current, pulling my wife a few inches further from me every Sunday dinner, until one day the distance was too wide to swim back across. I stood in our bedroom that last night before I left for good, looking at the bed we'd shared for 5 years, and a memory came back to me clear as glass. There was a season where I picked up night shifts at a construction site off Cheshire Bridge just to save enough for the designer bag Ayana had been eyeing in a magazine for weeks. I handed it to her one night, still smelling like sawdust and concrete dust from a 12-hour shift, and she wrinkled her nose and said, "You smell like sweat and cement. Why can't you get a nicer office job, something more presentable?" I just smiled and nodded. I didn't tell her I'd turned down a daytime promotion that same month, one that would have paid more, that kept me at the office past 7 every night. I turned it down so I could be home for dinner. She never knew. I never made her feel like she owed me the knowledge. When I finally asked her, standing in that emptied-out bedroom with rain still tapping the window, why she'd done this, why tonight, why like this, she didn't flinch. She told me the plan had been in motion for 14 months. Her mother had been the one to plant it and water it. "You deserve better," Kiara had told her over and over, at Sunday dinners and long phone calls I was never part of. "Azriel is your future." 14 months. That number landed on me heavier than the rain had. Because 14 months ago was the exact night I'd found that message on her phone. Is the exit strategy ready? How do we keep him from suspecting? I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't overreacted. I had, if anything, underreacted. Because I never once let her see that I already knew. And there was a piece I hadn't put together yet. One that would sharpen the whole picture considerably. Azriel Reed wasn't some man Ayana had simply met at a bar or through a friend of a friend. He was her direct supervisor at the marketing firm downtown. The man signing off on her raises. The man who could make or break her next promotion with a single conversation in a closed-door office. That's not romance. That's leverage. Dressed up in a slate gray suit and a practiced smile. A woman's boss deciding her next 5 years, both professionally and personally, is not a love story. It's a power imbalance with better lighting. I didn't say any of that to Ayana that night. I just nodded slowly, The way you nod when a puzzle finally clicks into a shape you didn't want to see. My wife had spent over a year building an exit, while I spent that same year quietly building something else entirely, something none of them had the first idea about. I carried my last box out to my truck under a sky that hadn't let up once. Kiara watched from the doorway, arms still crossed, satisfied, like she'd just closed a difficult business deal. Azriel stood a step behind her, hand tucked in his pocket, doing his best impression of a man who belonged in that house. And Ayana, my wife for 5 years, stood at the edge of the porch light, watching me load a duffel bag into the bed of a truck she used to complain wasn't nice enough for our driveway. I climbed into the driver's seat, rain streaming down the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, and I sat there a moment before starting the engine. I looked back at the house one last time. Warm light spilling from the windows, 3 silhouettes moving inside like nothing important had just happened on that porch. I turned the key. The old engine caught on the second try, same as always. I said one thing out loud to the empty cab of that truck, quiet enough that only I could hear it. They think I'm about to be homeless and wandering tonight. They have no idea I already have everything I need waiting for me. I pulled out of the driveway on Peachtree Street and didn't look in the rearview mirror once. Kiara spent 14 months coaching her own daughter into another man's arms. Comment, mother, if you think Kiara did more damage than Ayana ever could have alone. Or comment, wife, if you think Ayana should have had a spine of her own, and no mother could have made her do it. 2 days after I stood in that rain, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A lawyer's office in Midtown Atlanta, just off West Peachtree Street. The voice on the other end asked if I was Zion Hale, son of Marcus Hale. I said yes, slowly, because my father had been gone 6 years, and lawyers don't usually call that long after a funeral, unless something has finally come due. I drove to the office the next morning. Glass building, quiet waiting room, a paralegal who offered me coffee. I didn't drink. The attorney, a calm older man named Mr. Ferris, slid a folder across the desk and said, "Your father asked us to hold this until the right time." He was very specific about that phrase, the right time. "We've been waiting for a signal from you for 6 years, Mr. Hale. Your call last month, asking about his old business records, was the signal." I want to explain something about my father, because most people who knew him only saw a construction worker in steel-toed boots and a faded Braves cap. What they didn't see was a man who'd been quietly buying small parcels of land around Atlanta since the early 90s, back when Midtown was still rough around the edges and nobody wanted to touch it. He never talked about money at the dinner table. He talked about patience. "Buy what people overlook," he used to tell me, "and let the city catch up to you." Mr. Ferris opened the folder. Inside were deed transfers, a trust document, and a stake in a real estate development firm, 47% ownership, held quietly under a holding company bearing my grandmother's maiden name. Properties across Buckhead and Midtown, a portfolio, all told, worth just north of $12 million. Then he turned one page further and tapped a single line item. The house on Peachtree Street. The house Ayana had walked out of that porch in front of. The house her mother called modest but respectable, had been folded into that same trust 2 decades earlier, long before I'd ever bought a ring. I hadn't been paying a mortgage all those years, so much as maintaining an asset that was already mine, quietly, in a name none of them had ever thought to check. I sat there in that leather chair for a long moment, not because I didn't believe it, but because I was doing math I never expected to do. $12 million, 47%. A silent stake in a company whose name I'd heard before, though I couldn't place where. I thought about my father's hands, thick and calloused, and how he used to come home from a job site smelling like sawdust, same as I had the night I handed Ayana that designer bag. I used to think he just liked the work. Now I understood he'd been running two lives at once, the visible one in steel-toed boots and the quiet one in ledgers and land deeds, and he'd never once let the two cross paths where anyone could see. He told me once, on the porch of the house I grew up in, "Son, a smart man lets the world underestimate him for as long as it's useful. Just make sure you know when the useful part is over." I hadn't understood that sentence at 16. Sitting in that lawyer's office at 37, soaked in the wreckage of my own marriage, I understood it completely. Then Mr. Ferris said the sentence that changed everything. "This holding company is the majority backer behind Cardwell Reyes Marketing Group. I believe that's where your wife is employed." For a second, the room tilted. I wasn't just a man who'd quietly inherited money. I was, without ever knowing it, the silent hand behind the very paycheck my wife had been so proud of. The promotions she credited entirely to her own hustle. The office she decorated to impress people who reported indirectly through layers of ownership to me. Some part of me wanted to laugh at the size of the irony. A larger part of me felt something closer to grief, because it meant every argument about who was doing more in our marriage had been standing on ground she never even knew was mine. I asked Mr. Ferris to slow down and explain it plainly. He did. My father's holding company had been a passive investor in the marketing firm for nearly a decade, structured through layers of paperwork, specifically so employees would never trace it back to any single family name. Ayana's raises, her office, her title, all of it existed inside a company my father had quietly helped keep afloat during 2 rough years I remembered her complaining about, but never asking questions. Then he added something that made my stomach turn in a different direction. "There's one more thing you should know, Mr. Hale. About 3 months ago, someone using your wife's employee credentials attempted to access equity and ownership files on the company's internal portal. IT flagged it as unusual activity and closed the session before any files were opened. We don't know what she was looking for, but someone in that building had already started asking questions about who really owned the ground beneath her feet. 3 months ago. That was 11 months after the message about the exit strategy, and 11 months before the night she stood on that porch and told me my place in the house was over. She hadn't just been planning an exit. At some point, she'd started hunting for what she might be leaving on the table, and she'd come up empty-handed, because the paperwork was buried 3 layers deeper than she knew how to dig. I left Mr. Ferris's office that afternoon with a folder under my arm and a very different picture of my own life. But the folder wasn't finished giving up its secrets. Later that week, going through the marketing firm's public contract filings, public record, nothing illegal about reading them, I found a project routing discrepancy tied to a name I now knew well. Azrael Reed had been quietly redirecting a 6-figure client contract, one that belonged to Cardwell Reyes, into a shell company registered under his own name in Fulton County. Fabricated approval signatures, falsified vendor documentation. It was the kind of thing that doesn't just get a man fired, it gets a man indicted. I sat with that discovery a long time before I moved on it, because I wanted to be sure, and because rushing has never been how I do anything. My father didn't build $12 million in overlooked land by rushing. He built it by watching and waiting and letting the picture become undeniable before he ever made a move. I hired a forensic accountant that same week, a quiet woman named Ms. Whitfield, who'd done work for my father years earlier and still kept an office 2 floors below Mr. Ferris. She confirmed within 4 days what I already suspected. The shell company under Azrael's name had received 2 wire transfers totaling just over $90,000, both disguised as consulting fees for work no one could produce a single document proving had ever been done. Georgia law doesn't look kindly on that kind of paperwork. Neither does the client, whose contract got quietly rerouted without their knowledge. There was one more piece, and this one hurt in a quieter way than the others. 2 years earlier, when Kiara was diagnosed, I'd set up that anonymous hospital fund so her treatment would be covered without anyone ever tracing it to me. What I hadn't known until a conversation with the hospital administrator who'd helped me set it up was that Kiara herself had once asked, off the record, whether the anonymous donor might be someone connected to her daughter's marriage. She'd been told, truthfully, that the fund's donor wished to remain unnamed. She had her suspicions. She let them go quiet rather than risk owing me anything out loud. She took the gift, kept the silence, and never once let it soften how she talked about me at that dinner table. That night, I walked out of a different office building than Mr. Ferris's, this one downtown, where I'd stopped by to review paperwork on my father's largest holding, and stood on the sidewalk under a sky just beginning to clear. Streetlights were coming on up and down the block. Somewhere above me, the Atlanta skyline was lit up gold against a darkening blue. The kind of view my father used to point at and say, "One day, some of that will be yours, and you won't even have had to ask for it." I said quietly, to no one but myself, "You called me a man with no ambition. You just didn't know which ambitions you weren't allowed to see yet." Because a portfolio and a truth are two very different kinds of weapons. And I hadn't decided yet which one I was going to use first. 3 weeks after that night on the porch, after Ms. Whitfield's forensic report was finalized, and my attorney had quietly filed what needed filing, I put on a simple black suit, tailored close and clean, no flash to it at all, and I drove downtown to the Atlanta Marriott Marquis on Cortlandt Street. The Atlanta Chamber of Commerce held its annual gala there every year, the kind of event where the city's money and the city's ambition sit at the same round tables and pretend not to be measuring each other. I knew Ayanna would be there. I knew Kiara would be there, in something with lace on it. And I knew Azriel would be standing close enough to both of them to look like he belonged. I wasn't invited. I didn't need to be. My father's holding company had been a sponsor of that gala for 11 years running, under a name nobody in that ballroom had ever bothered to trace back to a construction manager's son. I walked into that atrium a little before 7. Chandeliers threw soft gold light across the marble floor. Servers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne. Somewhere near the stage, a string quartet was working through something slow and pleasant that nobody was really listening to. I found a spot near the back wall, and I waited. The way I've always waited, without making a sound about it. Ayanna wore a silver dress that caught the light every time she turned her head. Kiara had on teal lace and her good pearls, holding court near the dessert table like a woman who'd finally arrived somewhere she'd been trying to reach her whole life. And Azriel stood a half step behind Ayanna's shoulder, hand at the small of her back, playing the part of a man who'd been born into rooms like this one. None of them saw me yet. I want to tell you something about waiting rooms and ballrooms, because they teach you the same lesson if you pay attention. Nobody looks twice at the man standing quietly near the exit. They're all too busy performing for each other, checking who's watching them, who they should be seen next to. I'd learned that lesson young, watching my father stand at the edge of rooms his own money had built, never once needing to announce it. I stood there in that same posture now, watching Ayanna laugh a little too loudly at something Azriel said, watching Kiara accept a compliment on her pearls with the practiced grace of a woman who'd been rehearsing for this exact kind of evening her whole life. 3 weeks ago, I was a man standing in the rain with a soaked bag of takeout. Tonight, I was standing in a ballroom that existed in part because of decisions my family had made before either of them had ever heard my name. The MC tapped the microphone around 7:30, and the room settled into that particular hush a crowd makes when it senses something important is about to be said. "Before dinner begins," he announced, "we'd like to recognize this year's largest single contribution to our foundation, a pledge of $2.5 million toward programs supporting Black women and children across Metro Atlanta, made by a donor who has asked, until tonight, to remain anonymous." I walked toward the stage. I heard the room shift behind me, a ripple of whispers moving table to table faster than I could walk. By the time I reached the microphone, Ayana had turned all the way around in her chair, and every drop of color had left her face. Kiara took one step backward, like the floor had tilted under her heels. Azrael tried to hold his smile in place, but I've built enough of my life reading rooms and reading people to know exactly what a man looks like when he's calculating an exit that no longer exists. I looked out over that ballroom, and I kept my voice level, the same way I'd keep it discussing a construction timeline. 3 months ago, my wife and my mother-in-law put me out of my own house, in the rain, and told me I brought nothing of value to their lives. Tonight, I think everyone in this room deserves to hear the truth. Standing up there, I wasn't angry in the way I thought I'd be. I'd imagined this moment for weeks, and I'd expected fire. What I felt instead was something quieter and heavier, a kind of grief for the years I'd spent making myself smaller so the people I loved could feel bigger. I watched Ayana's hands shake around her water glass, and some old stubborn part of me still wanted to cross the room and steady her. But I understood, standing there under those lights, that protecting her from this moment would only teach her the same lesson that had gotten us here, that my dignity was always negotiable, and hers never was. I let the moment stand. For the first time in 5 years, I let myself matter more than her comfort. I nodded toward the screen behind me, and the slide I'd prepared came up. Routing documents, forged approval signatures, wire transfers to a shell company registered under Azrael Reed's name. $90,000 in fabricated consulting fees for work that never happened. A murmur rolled through the crowd like weather. I saw 2 people quietly lift their phones and start recording. Azrael's practiced smile finally gave out completely. Then I turned to Ayana and set a folder on the table in front of her. "I filed for divorce a week ago," I said. "Everything you've been living in, the house, the holding company, all of it, was inherited property, held in a family trust years before we ever met. It was never marital property to divide in the first place. And under Georgia law, marital misconduct and concealment can still affect what a court awards beyond that. Either way, you won't be entitled to what you were hoping for." She didn't reach for the folder. She just stared at it like it might bite her. Azrael finally found his voice, though it came out thinner than the confidence he usually wore like a second suit. "This is a private matter," he said, glancing around at the room full of witnesses he'd very much like to disappear right then. "You don't need to do this here." "You didn't need to falsify vendor contracts," I said, "but here we are." A man near the front, someone I recognized vaguely as a partner at one of the bigger law firms downtown, was already on his phone, voice low, saying the word compliance more than once. I imagine Azrael's Monday morning was going to look very different than he'd planned. I brought up one more slide, the last one, and this was the one I'd debated including until the morning of the gala. An email, over a year old, from Kiara's account to Ayana's. "Don't worry about the money, baby. He'll keep paying as long as he thinks we still need him. Just keep playing along a little longer." The room went completely silent. Kiara lowered herself into the nearest chair, both hands pressed flat against the white tablecloth like she needed something solid to hold on to. Ayana began to cry, quietly at first, then not quietly at all, her shoulders shaking under that silver dress that had looked so untouchable an hour earlier. I hadn't done that to humiliate her for the sake of humiliation. I'd done it because for 5 years, every time I stayed quiet to protect her feelings, it cost me a piece of my own dignity that I never got back. I wasn't interested in collecting more silence. I stepped down off that small stage while the whispers kept rising around me, and I walked past Ayana's table one last time. I stopped just long enough to say, "You and your mother put me out because you decided I wasn't worth keeping. You had no idea what you were actually standing next to. And you still don't know I've prepared for the worst version of tonight, too. I didn't wait for a response. I walked out through the same glass doors I'd come in through, past the valet stand, into a night that had finally stopped raining. I sat in my car in that parking deck on Cortlandt Street for a long while, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, watching the lit-up windows of the ballroom high above me. I could still make out shapes moving behind the glass, the party trying to remember how to be a party again. I said quietly, to no one but the empty car, "They think tonight was their night to survive. They have no idea. Tonight was only the beginning." In the days after the gala, my phone lit up constantly with the name of the woman who'd been my wife for 5 years. I didn't answer. Not out of cruelty, but because I'd already said everything I needed to say under those chandeliers, and repeating it in private wouldn't change a single fact on the record. Kiara tried a different approach. She showed up at my office in Midtown, the real one, the one that belonged to the holding company my father had built, and got exactly as far as the lobby security desk before a guard named Mr. Devon politely explained that she wasn't on any visitor list and never would be. Azrael was terminated the following morning. Within 2 weeks, he was facing formal fraud charges tied to the falsified contracts, the kind of legal trouble that doesn't quietly disappear, no matter how good your tailor is. I want to be clear about something, because it matters more than the satisfaction of watching it all unravel. I never went looking for personal revenge. I didn't chase Azrael's downfall past the evidence that was already true. I finalized the divorce cleanly, kept the house in Buckhead because I was, and had always been, its actual owner. And I let the legal system handle what the legal system is built to handle. Ayana did try, once, in person. She waited outside the foundation's new office on a Thursday afternoon, sunglasses on despite the overcast sky, arms crossed against a wind that wasn't especially cold. She asked if we could talk, just talk, nothing more. I told her there was nothing left to negotiate that a courtroom hadn't already settled, and I meant it gently, without the edge I could have used. She nodded, the way you nod when you already knew the answer before you asked the question, and she got back in her car. I watched her drive off toward Decatur, where I'd heard she was staying with a friend from college, and I felt something close to peace watching those taillights disappear around the corner. What I built instead was something with my father's patience in it. I started the Hale Legacy Foundation that same spring, a small organization based right there in Atlanta, dedicated to supporting Black women navigating hardship in marriage. Women who'd been left with nothing, women rebuilding credit and confidence and a sense of their own worth after someone convinced them they didn't have any. We funded emergency housing for 6 families in our first 2 months alone, women who needed exactly what I once needed on that porch in the rain. Somewhere safe to land while they figured out the rest. It felt like the right use of a name my father spent 30 years quietly turning into something solid. 3 months after that gala, a handwritten letter arrived at my office. I recognized Kiara's handwriting before I even opened it. Careful cursive, the kind taught in a different generation of Georgia schoolrooms. She wrote, "I was wrong. Ayana's father used to tell me you were the best thing that ever happened to our family. I let fear of being poor again convince me to throw that away. I'm sorry, Zion. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I see it now." I sat with that letter a long while before I did anything with it. Then, a few days later, Ayana's cousin Renata, the one person from that family who'd always treated me decently, and the one who still checked in on me now and then, mentioned something in passing that told me more than the words on that page ever could. Kiara had shown her that same letter, nearly finished, almost 2 months earlier, right around the time the fraud charges against Azrael first became public. She kept asking me if she should send it, Renata said. She wanted to see how things were going to shake out first. Kiara had written those words of remorse early. And then she had waited, watching to see how the wind would blow, before deciding whether sending them was worth the risk. Even her apology had been calculated. I sat alone that evening in my apartment in Midtown, the letter resting on the table in front of me, the lights of the city starting to come on outside my window, one by one. I didn't feel angry reading it. I felt something quieter than that. Relief, mostly. Because for years I had wondered if I'd imagined the coldness in that house, if I'd been too sensitive, too demanding of appreciation I had no right to expect. That letter, calculated as it was, confirmed something I'd needed confirmed. It had never been in my head. It had been real, and it had been deliberate, and none of it had ever been my fault to carry. I folded the letter and set it in a drawer I don't open very often anymore. I said out loud, to an apartment that finally felt like it belonged entirely to me, "You calculated all the way to the end, Kiara. But you never knew I'd calculated all the way to the end, too. You just never got to see where mine landed." Outside my window, Atlanta kept moving the way it always does. Buses and brake lights and somebody's music drifting up faintly from the street below. I sat there a long while, not because I needed to grieve anything else, but because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had nowhere urgent to be, and no one waiting behind a locked door to remind me what I wasn't worth. I thought about my father again, the way I found myself doing more and more that year. He never got to meet Ayanna, not really. He'd passed before things turned as sour as they eventually did, though I suspect he clocked something in her long before I was willing to admit it myself. He used to say patience wasn't about waiting quietly for good things to happen. It was about being ready when they finally did. I understood, sitting in that apartment with a folded letter in my drawer and a foundation with my name on it downstairs in the filing cabinet, that I had finally become a man my father would recognize completely. For the first time in a long time, the silence in that apartment felt like mine. A year after that gala, I stood in Piedmont Park on a warm Saturday morning, watching a group of kids run through the grass near the lake, part of a new scholarship program the foundation had just launched, for children of the women we'd helped. Ayanna had settled into a quieter life over in Decatur, sharing a place with an old college friend, rebuilding whatever she was going to rebuild. Kiara still lived alone in the Buckhead house, the house I still legally owned, under one simple condition I'd laid out through my attorney: no contact, in exchange for a roof. Azrael had left Atlanta entirely not long after his case concluded, and as far as I know, nobody in this city has heard his name mentioned since. I wasn't angry anymore. I want you to understand that clearly, because anger had never really been the engine underneath any of this. What I felt instead, walking through that park, was something closer to purpose. Most days I spent time at the foundation, sitting across from women who reminded me, in one way or another, of myself standing in that rain 3 years ago. People the world had quietly decided weren't worth very much, right up until they proved otherwise. One woman I met that spring, a widow named Miss Corinne, who'd lost her husband, and then very nearly lost her house to a nephew who'd talked her into signing papers she didn't fully understand, sat across from my desk and asked me, almost shyly, why a man in my position would spend his Saturdays helping strangers instead of enjoying what he'd earned. I told her the truth. I told her that for 5 years, somebody made me feel like showing up quietly and doing right by people was a character flaw instead of a virtue. Helping women like her was the closest thing I had to proof that it never was. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment in Midtown, looking out at the same skyline I'd looked at the night I first learned who my father really was. I said quietly, "They put me out because they decided I wasn't worth keeping. But that very decision is what set me free to become the strongest version of myself I've ever been." There's one more thing I never told anyone, not even Mr. Ferris, until now. Our house on Peachtree Street had a security system already installed when the property came into the family trust, years before Ayana and I ever moved in. A simple camera covering the living room and front entry, the same kind half the houses on that street had after a string of break-ins a few years back. Nobody had ever thought twice about it. Once I started noticing the small cracks in Ayana's story, I did one thing differently. I asked my attorney to preserve copies of that footage, month by month, the same way you'd preserve any record you might need later. Nothing hidden that wasn't already there. Nothing installed in secret. Just a man making sure the truth wouldn't quietly disappear if he ever needed it. Mister? Ferris held on to that footage, along with everything else, under a standing instruction I gave him the week after the gala. If Ayana, Kiara, or Azriel ever attempted renewed contact, harassment, or legal action against me, the full file, footage included, would be forwarded immediately to the appropriate authorities as part of my legal protection. No further conversation required. Not a threat I ever spoke aloud to any of them, just a boundary, written into a legal file, the same way you'd file an insurance policy and hope you never have to use it. I think about that standing instruction sometimes, sitting quiet on my couch at night. I had the paperwork in place to make sure those three people could never quietly come back around and unravel what I'd finally built. Some nights, I won't pretend I wasn't tempted to go further than protection, to turn that file into something sharper. But I kept coming back to the same thought. If I used it to punish them beyond what the truth had already cost them, I'd be proving I was exactly what they always assumed, a man who needed to destroy something in order to feel like he mattered. I didn't need that anymore. Letting the file sit untouched in a lawyer's cabinet wasn't weakness. It was the last, quietest way I had of proving I'd never needed their permission to know my own worth. I chose forgiveness, not because they earned it, but because I refused to let the worst 3 minutes of my life on that porch be the thing that defined the rest of it. I stood at my window a long while that night, watching the lights of a city my father helped build, without ever once asking for credit. And I felt, finally, entirely at peace. Somewhere out past those lights was a house in Buckhead, with one woman inside it, living quietly with what she'd done, and a woman in Decatur learning how to build a life without an audience to perform for, and a man who'd disappeared from this city entirely rather than face what he'd left behind. None of that was my burden to carry anymore. I'd carried enough for all of us for 5 long years. It was, finally, someone else's turn. This story reminds us that the truest measure of a person was never what they announced at Sunday dinner. It was what they quietly built, while everyone around them assumed nothing much was being built at all. If you spent 40 or 50 years married to a man who never raised his voice, never needed the credit, and just kept showing up with something warm in his hands, even on the nights he was worn clean through, you already know exactly what I'm describing. Don't save the saying so for a hospital waiting room or a funeral program. Say it this week in something small and specific. If he still insists on mowing the yard himself past the age he probably should, meet him at the door with his sweet tea before he even asks, and tell him plainly that you noticed the work. If you're the one who's alone in the house now, and 4 o'clock in the afternoon has a way of feeling too quiet, pick one day, Sunday, right after church, before the pregame shows start, and call one grandchild on that same day every week. Tell them one specific thing about the person you lost. Not just that you miss him, but the particular way he salted his tomatoes or hummed off-key doing the dishes. Keep his reading glasses on the nightstand if that's what steadies you, or pack them into the top drawer if that's what lets you breathe a little easier. Either choice is allowed. Neither one is betrayal. Patience and quiet loyalty were never weakness. They are simply the long, slow proof that you were right about your own worth all along, and that whoever doubted it was only ever revealing something true about themselves. The people who underestimate a steady heart usually find out, sooner or later, exactly what they walked away from. Most of them find out too late to do anything about it at all. Written from a human heart with AI's support. This story only hopes to send you a warm message. Kindness is never wasted. And even when the world feels harsh, there is always the light of justice and beautiful things quietly returning to those who are kind.